Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the ZFA Conversation for this evening. My name is Bren Carlil, and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Dr. Debra West as our guest. Debra was born in Melbourne and knew by 7 that she wanted to be a doctor, and she did just that, and then made Aliyah straight after completing her internship at the Alfred. But along the way, she was very active in the Jewish community, including in the B'nai Akiva youth movement. And in Israel, as we'll hear shortly, she not only specialized in emergency medicine, she has actually shaped the way it is practiced in Israel. And in 2017 was appointed director of the emergency department at the Samson Assuta Ashdod University Hospital, which was the first new public hospital built in Israel in 50 years. And she brought to this hospital an Australian model of emergency medicine with a department staffed exclusively 24/7 by emergency medicine trained physicians and nurses with a senior physician coverage on site around the clock. Now, Debra and her husband Hillel have 4 children, all of whom served in the IDF, and her oldest son and daughter-in-law are still serving as officers in the intelligence corps. And I would love to know whether or not that's where they meet, unless of course that's classified. And her younger son is a combat officer in the elite commando unit. Debra will be speaking about all of this and more tonight, and she will be speaking with Maya Gutman, who is a public affairs officer at the ZFA and a colleague of mine. Before I hand you over to Maya, remember, we welcome you to ask any questions at all. Just click that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in the question, and Maya and Debra will try to get to them during the conversation. But with no further ado, I will hand the conversation over to Maya.
Thanks so much, Bren. Debra, welcome. Just before we kick off, I do want to acknowledge that unfortunately we are meeting on the backdrop of a sad occasion for Debra and myself. My great aunt, Debra's aunt, passed away a couple of days ago, and we would like to take this opportunity to dedicate this conversation to her. Her name is Marta Weiss, and she, amongst many things, was a Holocaust survivor as well. She survived the horrifying experiments of Dr. Mengele, along with her sister Eva. A really remarkable woman. She spoke at schools in Melbourne, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and as part of her mission to create that legacy and continue the mission of keeping the memory alive of the Holocaust. She guided groups through Yad Vashem, through Auschwitz. She even lit a candle at the Knesset. She met Prince Charles. She spoke at the UN in 2016. She was a staunch Zionist, and one of the comments that she made at the UN was that the state of Israel is the greatest victory of the Jewish people, that the Jewish people could have over our enemies. And I think that's very relevant to our ZFA mission and what we do at the ZFA. Debra, if you'd like to say a few words as well.
I think you pretty much said it all, except to say that Auntie Martha died peacefully with all of her family around, her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren, all Israelis. And she died in Jerusalem on Yom Yerushalayim. And I think that was very fitting because right from the time of the war, the plan was to come back to Israel. She came to Israel 27 years ago, and she really dedicated her life here to developing a family and to looking forward, at the same time as looking back. So at the same time as taking all the students and all the Yad Vashem and all the tours to Auschwitz was so difficult for her, she would come back to her home in Jerusalem, to her family in Jerusalem, and realize that she fulfilled the Zionist dream. So she's Zichronah Baruch. May her memory be blessed.
Amen. Absolutely.
Thank you for acknowledging it.
And I think that's actually a really great point to segue into our topic today, and speaking to you as well, which is obviously such a lovely occasion. So your background as an Australian Israeli, you grew up in Melbourne in a Jewish Zionist home. You're an active member of the B'nai Akiva youth movement, both as a madricha and as a chanicha, as a leader and as a participant. And after graduating from Melbourne University, you made Aliyah with your husband.
Monash University.
And as Bren mentioned, all of the incredible achievements that you've made since then as well. You've made significant contributions and achievements in the world of medicine in Israel, bringing that Australian ethos into the Israeli world of medicine. So I guess we can kick off the conversation just by asking, as a new doctor coming from Australia to Israel, what has been your experience? Did you experience many differences? What were the challenges coming as a new Ola and into this new world? Oh, sorry, I think your audio just cut out. Just try and unmute again and reconnect. Apologies for this, everyone.
Followed by hash.
Here we go. Okay, and we're back.
Yeah, got a problem again, and may I need to enter the meeting ID followed by
You
hash.
have not entered any number. Please re-enter your meeting ID followed by hash.
Yes, that's all right. We can hear you now.
I can actually hear you, Deb.
You're good to go.
You have not entered any number. Please re-enter your meeting ID followed by hash.
You could probably hang up the phone because we can hear you through the computer now for some reason.
Goodbye.
Deborah, can you hear us now?
I have a problem with the meeting ID. It's cancelled for some reason. 1 second.
No, but Deborah, we can hear you now. It's all working.
We can hear you.
The situation is.
Mate, can you send me again the meeting ID and I'll put it in on the phone number again? I need the phone numbers like you sent before.
Yep, I'm sending it right now.
It's not on mute. My computer's not on mute.
No, but we can hear you, Deb.
Well,
So,
if you can hear me, I'll keep on talking and then just communicate me by that. Okay.
Yes.
So you asked me what was the difference between Australia and Israel. As I said, I came as a Ola Harasha in 1993, so 1994, so almost 30 years ago. Actually, I was I moved straight into medicine. I guess you can talk about not only the differences but the similarities. Medicine's medicine all around the world. It's about patient contact. It's about patient communication. It's about understanding where people come from and where they go. So there were some cultural differences. I was actually very surprised when I first arrived at how badly dressed all the doctors here were. People were walking around in bloodstone boots and shorts and t-shirts. And I came dressed up in a suit looking like I was told I would look like I was going to a wedding. So I learned to tone down my dress and fit in with the Israeli culture. Initially, I was quite surprised by how little patients were involved in decision-making process. Basically, we were the doctors and they were the patients, and we would say to them, you know, you have got heart failure and we're going to treat you, or you've got water in your lungs and we're going to treat you, as opposed to the Australian approaches, which is very inclusive, which is very much about a shared mental model. Let's talk about what's going on here and how we're going to treat it together. I have to say that medicine's come a long way, and now we much more talking about a shared mental model. Patients expect to be more involved. I think Dr. Google also helped, that people are much more informed nowadays, and they come in and they know what to expect, and they know what's going on, and they know to ask the right questions. And as a response, also the doctors and the nurses have lifted themselves up to the task. I think also that the language in Israel has become much more polite. I'm sure everybody who comes to Israel and goes to a restaurant now sees that the way you're treated by waiters and waitresses is very different to the way maybe it happened 30 years ago. So overall, we're getting closer in terms of the way we treat patients and the shared mental model. I still think there's places to go. I still think we've got a lot to learn from what I learned in Australia many years ago about how to communicate with patients. We're also a cultural melting pot, which I guess is also true of Australia. We've got a lot of Olim, a lot of new citizens that come from Russia and from Georgia, from Ethiopia, from France. So we have to be it's not only a matter of a language barrier, it's a matter of a cultural barrier. People from different cultures present with completely different complaints. Ethiopians, for example, as a rule, often come in with abdominal pain. Doesn't matter what their problem is. So you have to know that when they're saying I've got abdominal pain, it could still be a stroke, it could still be a heart attack, it could still be anything else going on. So they're quite significant cultural differences. A lot of people from the Russian community come in with high blood pressure. That's their presenting complaint. And so you have to learn some cultural competency. Different cultures from Australia, but the same concept. Now I'm not sure, May, how I'm going to know your next question. So you might have to write it as well, because I can't actually hear you, unfortunately. So maybe you can send me your questions, and then when I've finished, I can answer them back, which is a little bit low tech, but we have to learn how to improvise.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm actually just gonna, I know you can't hear me right now, but I'm gonna call
Okay.
now.
Yep.
We're doing a
I'm
little
with you.
bit of, we're doing a little bit of improv here.
No problem.
And just to try and mitigate this issue here. But yeah, that's it's super interesting to see how, I mean, there are a lot of similarities when you actually talk about it. There are a lot of similarities in the Australian community and the Israeli community, for instance, like what you said about the melting pot. Because in Melbourne, at least where I'm from and where you grew up as well, it is very similar in terms of the multicultural nature of the place, which is really, really interesting. My question, I guess, on this specific topic, have you made any specific changes to the Israeli model of medicine based on the models that you've worked in Australia?
Yeah.
And what
So I think that, yeah, so a couple. I mean, I have to say that every single day, and I'm not exaggerating, every single day, and every single shift, clinical or management, one second, I'm putting you on mute. I'm appreciative of what I learned in Australia, of the skills that I learned in Australia. I've done a number of national projects. The first one was actually on patient experience. It basically started in 2014, where I really couldn't bear the way people were talking to patients or about patients. I couldn't bear the fact that a patient would come in and complain, and a nurse's response or a doctor's response would be, "Who invited you? Nobody asked you to come. You didn't have to come. You're welcome to go home." And that was literally the response to patients who came into the emergency department and complained. Or, "I'm the doctor and you're the patient," or "Don't you see what sort of what conditions we're working under?" And I realized it was a real problem in Israel. I hooked up with the health ministry, and in 2014 we launched a program which was basically improving patient and physician and staff satisfaction and caregiver satisfaction in Israel. It was a program that was supported by a health ministry. We introduced it in 29 emergency departments around the country. It was very, very interactive. We basically it was a cultural changing thing. We brought every single department had to bring 7 representatives. They did 5 days of training on with simulations on basically how to behave. Every time I spoke to my mother and she'd say, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to introduce the course of patient experience." And she'd say, "What are you teaching them?" I say, "I'm teaching them to be nice." And basically it was a cultural change to say, the patients you cannot do good medicine without involving the patients, without having the patients understand. We made a really big difference. We saw that in patient satisfaction, which the scores went up from 56%, which meant that 44% of patients coming through emergency departments in the country were very unhappy with their treatment, to scores that are now sitting around 75%, which is pretty good. Considering the 2.9 million patients that come through emergency departments a year, basically a third of the population, that was a really important achievement. And that was definitely something. In fact, one of the people involved on the panel was Professor George Breitberg, who's from Australia, who's my mentor, was my mentor then and continues to be my mentor. And he was part of the team putting together the project. Another totally Australian-based project is also in emergency medicine. You would think that in Israel, emergency medicine is more developed than anywhere around the world, because we literally deal with trauma and war and mass casualty events all the time. In our hospital here, we've already dealt with 5 in the last 5 years, 1 last week. So you think that emergency medicine is really developed, but it's actually not. Emergency medicine in Israel only started as a specialty in 2002, and only as a primary specialty in 2011, which means in Australia, for example, in 1990, when I left, it was already a specialty. So we're basically 20 years behind Australia and about 50 to 60 years behind America. So emergency medicine in Israel doesn't work like in Australia. It works like in Europe, which is divided emergency departments with basically at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the surgeons, the orthopedic surgeons, the internal medicine doctors come down dragging their feet, because that's not the profession that they chose, and start staffing the emergency departments. They don't know emergency medicine, they know their field. And so basically what happens is that the emergency department is a place of work as opposed to a body of knowledge and of thought, and a specialty of dealing with emergencies. So we started changing that about 20 years ago. But the problem was that we've got 29 emergency departments in the country, and every single one was working differently. They still are, to a great extent. And we realized that we couldn't make this move. We couldn't actually develop a profession in emergency medicine because people weren't trained. So what I established also with Professor Breitberg as my mentor was that in about the same year, actually, it was 2014, we established a national Israeli course in emergency medicine. It took us 2 years. We actually started thinking about it in 2012. It took us 2 years to get it up and running, because we had to make it compulsory. We figured if it wasn't compulsory, if it didn't have the backing of both the Scientific Council and the Israeli Medical Association and the Health Ministry, then nobody would send their doctors. And so it took us 2 years to get this made part of the syllabus. And it is a course that's been running for the last 9 years. It's compulsory. All the residents in the country go through the course. So we've had well over 300 residents going through the course. Currently, there are 47 in the current course. And it's a course that's completely interactive. All of the doctors from around the country come together and learn together. It's incredible for communication. It's incredible for one learning what the other one is doing and what they're not doing. It's created a real culture of emergency medicine, and we teach only things that are not found in the books. There is nothing, anything that is in the literature, we don't teach. We call it standardizing care and raising the standard of care. So we teach just cutting edge stuff. What came out yesterday, what we think about it, it's all, there's no presentations, it's all interactions, simulations, debates, discussions, and it is enormously raised the level of emergency medicine around the country. And that's been something that's been great and is ongoing. I'm busy passing it on to the next generation to take over from here.
And that sounds like such an important initiative. It's really incredible to think what it would have been like before something like this. I can hear an echo, so I'm going to just...
That's okay, because I'm listening to it, all right.
Okay, sorry. Apologies with the audio improvising that we're having here. So, I mean, you mentioned that Israel is quite slow in developing and making the emergency medicine profession in terms of developing it. Why is that the case?
It's a good question. I asked myself that the whole time. And now I'll shoot myself in the foot a little bit and think, well, I think most people don't like change and people don't like to be told that there's a better way to do it, but nobody more than the Israelis. Okay. We've done it, the way we do it is right, and we spend our whole time trying to prove why we're doing it better instead of saying this works in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of Asia, let's get on board. I think there's another thing, if you have a look at it, that Australia has what's called a scoop and run process, which basically means that, the concept is ambulances bring people to emergency departments and they treat them. Europe has a stay and play. Actually, they're changing a little bit. Stay and play means that the doctors go on the ambulances and treat people in the field. Best example of that was Princess Di. Best example. Princess Di, I don't know if you know, when she was in the fatal car accident, she was actually alive at the scene. The doctors came to the scene, they did stay and play. She was 4 kilometers from a major trauma center. She was alive when they came. They were talking to her. She was in the field for almost 45 minutes. When they came to the trauma center and they opened her up, they realized if she'd got there early, they could have saved her. And that was when the concept of stay and play, basically big people began to realize that they need to move to the Anglo model of scoop and run. So Israel was very much the stay and play. Israel was like, we've got really good teams. We can take them out to the field. We'll treat them in the field. When they come into the emergency department, we don't necessarily need the specialists. Also, our paramedics are very, very good. And then, so it was a change of concept. And change of concepts take a long, long time. We're definitely doing it now. The other thing that I guess the next stage of it was that when we opened up the hospital here in 2017, and I was offered the position, I still have no idea why, but when I was offered the position, the first thing I said was the only way I'll take it is if you allow me to start with a carte blanche with the white page and allow me to build an emergency department based on the Australian model. I had to prove it. I had to present the 2 models, explain why one was better than the other, had to bring a lot of literature and a lot of support. Which was very hard, by the way, because the 2 models have never, ever been compared officially, ever. It was always just a given that this is right. Nobody's ever compared one against the other. But basically, I convinced the management to make the change, which was very significant change. And so we've been practicing the Australian model in our emergency department ever since 2017. We are still the only department in the country to do it in a full manner. In fact, we're still the only emergency department in the country to be staffed 24/7 only by emergency medicine doctors without anybody else as part of our integral staff. And we made some other changes that we're also the only department in the country, which I also brought from Australia. For example, I don't know if you guys know, but in Israel, residents are still working 24, 26-hour shifts all around the country. Something that did not exist in 1993 when I was an intern, did not exist. It was unheard of. How can a resident work in such an important job? How can you work 24/7? And here still residents are doing 26-hour shifts. Now, 3 years ago, they started a protest and residents went on strike to start working in shifts. And the only person in the country, the only department And it was to do that, we had to change everything. We had to change the pay scale and how many residents you need and everything. But that's another thing that's fully based on the Australian model. And the third thing, which is actually even going further than the Australian model, is that we put on senior doctors 24/7. So in Australia, not every emergency medicine department has got a senior doctors on 24/7. Having said that, the training is very long. So the more senior residents are pretty senior. We introduced the fact that we have not had 1 minute since we opened our department and have had without a senior doctor. I think it's critical. I think it's a no-brainer. Obviously, a senior doctor needs to be on site, not just on call in emergency departments. That's been a major effort to put in. Now, there's since then 2.5 years ago another department added, and now there are 3 departments out of 29 with senior doctors 24/7. It's a battle I'm still fighting.
Well, it's an important battle that you're fighting, because Israel is probably the most important place that we need to have. Apologies again with the echo, but Israel is probably the most important place that we need to have a strong emergency unit, especially because of obviously what we've experienced recently, or what you've experienced recently with all the rocket attacks. Israel has just emerged from Operation Shield and Arrow, which again we saw over 1,000 rockets being sent into Israel from Gaza through the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I guess my question to you is, obviously it's very different, you know, growing up in Australia, watching the conflict through the television, and now you're not only in Israel, very close. I think the Assuta hospital is located less than 40 kilometers from Gaza. So you're not only in Israel experiencing, but you're actually on the front line. You're in the hospital that's supposed to be immediately responding to these to the casualties that arise from these kinds of terror attacks. What can you tell us about operating in such an environment?
Okay, so as you can see, if you look behind me, my room is a bomb shelter, so my windows are closed. We basically work under fire. We've had 5 missions since we opened the hospital, which basically there's 1 a year. I don't know if you've noticed, but they're becoming basically increasingly frequent. Whereas always the hope is that they'll be increasingly distant. We operate continuously under fire. We are continuously ready for it. So what does that mean in action before? It basically means we have to have complete preparedness all the time. So we have a project, for example, last week, every 3 months, we have a week of mass casualty event preparedness. We had it last week. I can even show you the games that we played in order to get ready. It means that every single day when we staff our staff into different positions in the emergency department, we also have staffing for a mass casualty event. Like if we've got a mass casualty event today, if we get hit by a bomb or what have you, everybody already knows how to spin into action. We have protocols on how we act in mass casualty events that are so drilled that we can do them in our sleep. We've got ones for when we've got full staff, when we've got partial staff at night, during the day. It's a mass casualty plus a toxicological event, and basically all the different variations, and we constantly drill it. So we're very prepared. We have surprise drills. We have surprise drills where the health ministry or people or of the home front where you were part of may come into the hospital, and in the middle of a shift they will bring us wounded, and we have to show how we're going to respond, and then we do debriefs, and we constantly get better and better. So that's sort of how we get prepared. We're very prepared. We are constantly thinking about it, and any new person who comes in has to go through the drills and know where we're at. What does it mean when it actually happens? When it actually happens, it's a very different affair to being prepared. I mean, you have to remember that, as you said, we're 35 kilometers from fire. We're under fire. As soon as there's any event in Gaza, we're under fire. So most of our staff lives in Ashdod and the surroundings. I personally live 40 minutes away. From my point of view, I sleep in the hospital for the whole week because I don't really have the time to get back and forwards, and I can't really afford to get back and forwards under fire. So last week I wasn't here. I was actually in Poland, but in every other Mifta and every other fair I've been here, and I just basically move into my room and sleep here. My staff can't do that. They've got their young children. They live in homes, and they're very torn because we absolutely have to staff our department during a mass casualty event or potential mass casualty event, and yet they've got their children and their elderly parents at home under the same fire. So think about it. We get an alarm that there's been a rocket that's fallen. The rocket's fallen here. So at the same time that we're getting ready to prepare to receive the next patient, they're thinking about, where's my mother? Where are my children? How terrified are they? Have they got into into their protected room. Where are they sitting in the stairwell? What are they doing? So people are very, very torn. So there's a number of things that we do at the level of the hospital. The moment there is any threat, we go into what's called a level of preparedness. The first thing that happens, we prepare the hospital. Preparing the hospital is that the security guards come, they close all the windows. As you can see, my windows are still closed from the last time. The whole hospital is protected. We're the only hospital in the country where the whole hospital is protected. It was built as a bomb shelter, except for the top floor, the 5th floor. So the first thing that happens, we close all the windows. The patients from the 5th floor come down to the other floors, and we all get a WhatsApp notes to say that we are on top level preparedness. We all acknowledge that we received it, and we all spring into action. At the level of our department, we've got a list of which emergency medicine doctors, nurses, and staff live within sort of a stone's throw, who are the first responders, and they all have to respond that they've got the call and they have to get ready. In terms of families, about exactly as I said, this paradox of like, what do? Do you come to work? Do you leave your family? The next thing we do is we open up a moadon. We open up a kids camp, which is open from the moment we're under fire. It's for children from the age of 2 and 12. And for all of the doctors, nurses, any of the support staff, anybody who's basically works in the hospital whose kids are under fire, they come and they get free childcare. It's fabulous. We've got instructors who come in, we've got soldiers who come in and help us, and we run a fabulous camp program. It means that you know your kids are with you, you know they're safe, you don't have to look for them, you can have lunch with them, and it actually becomes quite almost a festive environment. So that's one of the ways we deal with it. On the other hand, some people, their children are not appropriate, the children are too young or their parents are old, and they stay home. And so we also have a list of who are the people who can't come to work. We worry about them. We make sure that they're available to be with their families. So we sort of have to deal with both fronts, what's happening at home and what's happening in the hospital. When rockets fall, as I said, we hear the alarm and the patient comes in at the same time. There's no delay. We've had, you hear the whiz, you hear the iron dome, and the patient comes through the door. So we really are acting under fire.
It's an environment that we really can't comprehend here. We're so far from it. I mean, apart from really watching it on the news, but you're so far from the concept of being able to, understand what it's like to run to a bomb shelter. You've got, I think, 15 seconds in your area as well, which is something incomprehensible. I was just in Israel myself, and very close to that area when the first Nagla, the first batch of rockets came out, and it was a terrifying experience. So, I mean, it's really the first thing that you think of when you think of people that come as casualties to the hospital is you think of, the injured, the physical bodily harm that's someone's been inflicted with. But I'm interested to hear about, are there any kind of mental health cases? Because obviously we hear about some of the injured as nifgei charada, which is anxiety. I think that's how you would translate. I'm not sure if there's an exact terminology. But I mean, how is the hospital prepared to deal with the mental health cases that come in after such traumatic events? So,
there's all the numbers and then there's the people. And first of all, they're trauma. They're traumatized. They're not anxious. They're traumatized. And they're coming with real symptoms. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of the cases. I can't even remember which one it was. I think it was not the last one, the one before. There was a direct hit on a building. I can't remember where exactly it was. It was in the Ashdod area, and a family came in. And there was an elderly man and an elderly woman. I remember they came carrying their dogs. Because what do you do with your dogs? You've got little dogs in the house. What do you do with them? So they came into the emergency department with these cute little dogs on their laps. And there was one of the teenage children. Now, they refused to be treated. They were like, we're missing our granddaughter. We refuse to be treated. They had a 14-year-old girl who, by the way, her name was May, and she was missing. She was also in the house with them. She hadn't gone into the bomb shelter. Where is she? We don't know. They refused to be treated. They behaved like nifgei charada, which is these post-trauma, which is they're hyperventilating. They've got an increased heart rate and increased respiratory rate. That you don't know if they've actually been injured by shrapnel, or if they've got bodily injury, or if they've got a psychosomatic response to the trauma they're undergoing. Our protocol is they go into a room, we completely undress them, because the shrapnel that kills them is the one that's hidden under their armpit that you don't actually see, that's gone straight into their heart. So we have to completely undress them. And yet this family is not letting us do anything until we find their granddaughter. So, for example, so first of all, we have social workers who are first people on the scene, and they're critical. So we put a social worker on each one, and the first thing we did to treat those patients was find their granddaughter. She came in her pajamas, and as soon as she came in, we could treat them. And so then you treat their bodily injury, but then the real work begins, because you have to deal with the fact, the stress that they've gone under. Now, what you have to remember here is none of these people is For none of these people is it their first time. Every one of them, as soon as you start coming down, will start telling you their previous story. Now, this family, I walked them out when they were ready to go home. We'd cleared everything up. They'd spoken to the social workers. We get them follow up in the community as well. And I walked them out to the car, and they were sitting in the car and they weren't moving. And I said, "Where are you going to now?" They said, "We have no idea. We're going to a hotel room, but we don't even have a toothbrush. We don't have underwear. We don't know. Do we stop off at the pharmacy? We don't have money. We've got what we've got in our wallet, which is 150 shekel. What do we do? You don't go out of the house with your credit card." So they had to go and get, something, toiletries, so they could get through the night. Now, while they were there and they were working out their logistics with the social worker, the elderly man told me that this was his third time. He told me about a traumatic injury issue he had when he was a soldier in the war. He told me as a child how he'd been him and his grandfather were walking through an olive field. There was an Arab olive field, and they were picking some olives, and the Arabs took them and strung them up like on a grill, and told them, "We're going to slit your throat." So this person was traumatized from the age of 9. He got away from the age of 9. He was traumatized as an 18-year-old soldier. And it was like the last straw. And now I'm an elderly man, and my family was almost killed, and I couldn't find my granddaughter. These people, it's multiple hits. It's not a single hit. So it's really, really important to recognize it and to address it. And it's really important to give them follow-up. But Israel has a good system for follow-up of post-trauma victims.
This is very heavy stuff, especially for someone that's never kind of been exposed to anything like this. Is there any kind of training specific to this for the staff who have to deal with such very confronting images and confronting stories and very in the moment situations where they might not know how to deal with it? Are there any situations where staff get into PTSD kind of moments?
So absolutely. First of all, we teach in emergency departments and emergency medicine trained doctors. We teach a lot of one of the things I do in the course, by the way, in the national course, is we teach a lot of resilience, and we teach how to deliver bad news. Going back to why we've got the course, it's not in the national syllabus. It's not in the syllabus. Syllabus is not a single thing about how you should communicate to patients. So we introduce it through the course, and I do it also in the emergency department. We do a lot of how do you bear bad, not only how do you break bad news, how do you deal with having broken bad news? How do you deal with it? The other thing that we do is we do debrief straight after. The social worker will say, even on a single case, not only a multi-trauma, but we'll say we had a difficult case. We had young doctors, young nurses. Can you do a sort of a balance, a type of meeting where we talk about it and we discuss what we went through? And that's enormously helpful when we meet together and we go through, how did you feel? How did you go home? How do you process it? How do you work through it? Not enough, because you literally have to jump back on the same horse. Like you deal with these families. I remember another case of it was devastating. It was a patient a victim who he was a Haredi man, an ultra-Orthodox, and a rocket fell outside the building. He was running into the shelter. It was really rapid, no hardly any warning. It was 15 seconds. He was running into the shelter. There was a non-religious young woman, quite skimpily dressed, running into the shelter in front of him, and there wasn't enough room. And what he did was he pushed her in and he shielded her with his body. Instinctively, obviously he didn't have time to think. He shielded her with his body. And he was the victim. And he came in with a single shrapnel wound. He looked perfect. He came in, and as I said, under fire, we can hear, we rushed him into the trauma room. And the guy's without a pulse, where he was injured, and we found a single shrapnel wound under his breastbone, and it had gone straight into his heart. So first of all, as his family is coming in to find out what happened, we've already, the whole thing within a few minutes, you realize he's dead. You heard the story afterwards because the woman came to say, he saved my life, he saved my life. We're dealing with her, we're dealing with his family, we're breaking bad news, we're dealing with our staff of saying, how could that have happened and how come we couldn't save him? We worked on it very hard. We had a lot of sessions also with his family. His wife comes back, but she was pregnant. She was 9 months pregnant. She gave birth a couple of weeks later. I went to visit her afterwards. We developed a relationship, so we worked with her as well, and we worked with our staff on how to deal with it. But it opens up a fresh wound every single time. It's very difficult.
Must be very traumatic, and of course not always everything. There are always situations that in your field, every day is a new day. You never know what's going to get thrown at you. That's something that I learned, at least from my service in the army, especially in such a high risk environment. So I guess in dealing with that, in dealing with all of these mass casualty events, and you obviously learn as you go, and every event you'll come up with something new. But from this previous operation, for Operation Shield and Arrow, have you learned anything that's really said, all right, for next steps, next operation, God forbid that it won't happen, but in the future, how can we prepare better? What's the lessons that we've learned for moving forward?
As I mentioned, I actually wasn't, sorry, just put me down. I actually wasn't here for this one. I was in Poland. I was working at a workshop or presenting a workshop and doing a bit of a roots trip. So I was a bit distanced from it. But you know, we have status meetings. Whenever we have a mass casualty event, twice a day, we have status meetings and we do a debrief and we run through them. Only that most of the victims, as you mentioned, most of the victims we get in any war are victims of post-trauma. The anxiety victims, and one of the things that we did mention here was that was making sure that we really do have a network that looks after them as well. We're pretty trained. This is our 5th time doing the same thing, so we don't really have much. There's not really much room for improvement on it. You know, we know how everybody knows their job. Everybody knows how to act. We know how to look after the families. The hardest thing is to go back. Into routine and sort of wait for the next time. So I think we're pretty much drilled.
Is there anything maybe that Australia can learn from the way that Israel deals, especially with mental health cases and post-trauma? Do you think that there's anything in Australia that, I mean, the medical teams here can learn from how you guys do?
I think Australia can learn from how we practice, because we've developed so many different, people get sick of it. We do it every 3 months and we drill the whole hospital, and people are getting sick of the drills. So we've developed a whole lot of creative ways in how to practice for the drills. I think that's something we can, including, I've got a shulchan hall, like a war room, like we do in the army. We've got all sorts of different ways of drilling it. And I think that's something that we could definitely teach Australia, because we really do have it down pat. I think also the way we've learned to communicate, we've got our own system of how we communicate during mass casualty events. What happens in mass casualty events? It's a big, huge, loud noise. Everybody gets excited. Everybody's shooting things at everybody else, and a whole lot of things are happening at once. And we've developed a really simple way of keeping it quiet, where everybody only speaks to the person below them or above them. So the people treating the patients speak only to the patients, and the person in charge of their atar of their sort of section. The people who are who are given the management of the section speak only to their staff and to the people running the logistics. And we have a very, very clear line of communication, which works beautifully. We literally pass the ball from one to the other, and there's no loud noise. I think that's something you can learn. In terms of how to deal with post-trauma, yeah, I mean, I think Israel's getting better. We used to be terrible at dealing with post-trauma. I think they could learn from speaking to our social workers primarily, rather than even the doctors and the nurses. For example, we don't discharge anybody in a mass casualty event without them going through a social worker. Everybody, nobody can be discharged from the hospital until they've gone through, set in an area of social worker. The social worker assesses them, see what support system they've got, and refers them to a support system that is actually that they will be followed up by, and also contacts the support system to make sure they get in contact with them. So I think the sort of support system that you've got in the hospital and around the hospital is something that that everybody could learn from.
I think in Australia as well, specifically, I mean, you don't just because we don't have rocket fire, thank God. I mean, we do have other events that we can learn from, whether it's a car accident, whether it's someone suffering, God forbid, a crime at home. There's definitely a lot to learn from our events, and I think that's something that's that there's an opportunity here. And I guess my next question is, do you have any plans to possibly come and show the Australian teams here, or any kind of delegations that come from Israel, to do a kind of interspace work in that department?
Well, again, I'm turning back to Professor Breitberg. He's actually developed a degree in mass casualty events, in the management of mass casualty events, which is run by, I think it's Monash University, might be Melbourne. We haven't been invited yet. If we were invited, we'd be happy to do so. I think we do have what to teach. You've also had events. You had the asthma storm. There were a lot of lessons to learn from the asthma storm. We had the Har Meron tragedy, which was up north, which was a lot of lessons. By the way, one of the lessons that you learn that I think we could talk to Australia about is not only what happens in the hospital, what happens in the pre-hospital system. Because in the asthma storm that you had, a lot of patients who died were patients who, there were no ambulances available. ambulances, but were bringing patients to hospital and weren't freed up quickly enough to bring the next patients. We saw that also in Halmeron when we had the terrible, terrible tragedy on Lag BaOmer with all the patients who were trampled, that one of the problems was that the ambulances weren't free to go and bring the next patient around. So that's the sorts of national systems that you can learn from as well. I'd be happy to come. I'm sure we'd be happy to come and learn. We can learn also from the Australian system as they continue to do so. We have a great interrelationship of education learning one from the other. So that would obviously be a great thing to do.
Absolutely. And I think that just by having this conversation here, we can learn a lot from everything that you've done. And this is actually a really good opportunity to segue into talking about your upcoming projects, particularly one that you're currently taking on in Uganda. I believe that earlier this year you visited there as part of a new project that you're working on to bring Israeli emergency medicine physicians to Uganda to both work and educate. Could you tell us a little bit about what is going on there, how it's taking off?
Right. So basically there's an Israeli pediatrician who, when he retired, his name is Shai Pintov. And when he retired about 5 years ago, he decided to devote the next 10 years of his life to Uganda. And he moved to Uganda and developed a program there primarily to bring family medicine doctors out to help there. And we decided to join. We actually wanted to join 5 years ago, but we were busy setting up the hospital. And we joined in January. I went there with another one of my doctors, basically to assess the situation and see what we're talking about. It's a completely different world. Emergency department there, it's literally like nothing you've ever seen. First of all, dead quiet. Patients who are with burns and with amputees and with missing limbs actively do not say a word because they have a culture where they don't complain. When I say there's no facilities, I'm talking about there's no electricity. So you come into an emergency department and nobody seems to notice that the generator is not working and there's actually no light. There are 2 plugs in the wall and that's about it. I'm talking 15, 18 patients seriously wounded, many of them unconscious. The first patient we saw was had been attacked by a crocodile. I mean, like you see that every day. And the second one had both of his hands. We don't see it every day, but probably in Australia you do. And the second one was a refugee who'd come from Rwanda and had been caught stealing, so somebody chopped his hands off, and and so on and so forth, and terrible, terrible injuries, and no facilities to deal with them. In fact, when I say no facilities, as in the patient with the crocodile bite had been there for 15 hours, and his bandages that the family had been put on hadn't been changed because the doctors did not have a glove in order to remove his bandages in order to have a look at his wounds. I mean, we're talking about that level. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't examine these patients. I don't have a glove. We don't have bandages. You can't do an electrocardiogram because they have the machine, but they don't have the paper. I can't tell you what level of lack of resources they have. So we came with all these highfalutin ideas. We'll bring emergency medicine doctors. We'll teach them how to run an emergency department. And we came and we realized, first of all, we have to learn from them how you manage with zero resources. And yet we still have a lot to do. We still have a lot that we can actually bring with us, but basically with zero resources. So now what we're doing now is we're training up our staff. I'd have a meeting soon today. Every 2 weeks, we have a Zoom meetings with Uganda, with different specialists there who are teaching us about how you function in low resource environments. And then after 6 months, basically, of training while we're building up the program, our plan is to bring out emergency medicine doctors, both to work and to teach. What we did learn there is you don't come and teach them. You come and say, how can I serve you? What do you want to know? You teach them and they teach the others. You have to be very careful not to be patronizing. Like I said, they can teach us a lot more than we can teach them. What you can't really help with is resources, because they've got machines from all over the world that they can't use. They had a ventilator for babies that they've never used because it doesn't actually connect to their oxygen in the wall. So what we taught them was how to put an adapter to connect it to the oxygen in the wall. You really have to understand what their needs are. And you have to come with an environment of saying, I'm here, tell me what you need me to do and what you need me to help me develop. So we're looking, for example, one of the things that clearly we can bring in is point of care ultrasound. Ultrasound is a really cheap machine. It doesn't require anything except gel. We have to make sure they've got enough gel. You can do it by the bedside. And one of our first projects is to teach them how to use bedside ultrasound. I mean, they just got a CT when we were there. Even access to x-rays is very difficult. How to use point of care ultrasound to help diagnose and treat patients. That's a skill that we want to give them. But the other thing is just also to work there when we're there. You always question, am I doing any good? So I turn up for 2 weeks, then what? But as we say, that's what happens at work too. When I'm on a shift, I treat the patients I treat. And then when I go home, those other patients are not being treated by me. So it's a concept of you do what you can do, and whatever you can do, the people around you can learn from, and at least you've contributed your bit. And I think also to combine and realize there's people who need us even perhaps more than our patients need us. So I think it's also a way of being Zionistic, of being an Or LaGoyim, of being a light to the people. It's very significant to have Israelis that go over there and actually help out. So basically, yeah, the plan is to start the program officially in September. At the moment, we're training up our staff and assessing their needs.
I mean, it's incredible work what you're doing. I think it's so important as well in the humanitarian sense. But it's a little bit disappointing to hear that really, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to be a resource issue, like probably coming and giving your expertise, and education can really only go so far. I mean, in terms of the resources, can Israel do anything to help fund, or is the Ugandan government doing anything to help fund these kinds of projects, or is it really gung-ho, you're on your own? Like, what's the situation?
So the Ugandan government is not so resource poor, but they're not actually giving their funding at the moment. They're actually building an oil line. I don't know if you know. They found a great oil resource, and that's what they're focusing on. Shai Pintoff, who runs this program, he brings a lot of resources from Israel. He comes in with full containers, fills it up with everything that's almost out of date. A lot of things are out of date when they're really not, and brings them as much as we can. We bring them resources, but the resource they need is education, because they don't have that either, and that's something that's sustaining. I mean, if there's one thing that I've learned in my career is how important education is. If you give people that within their field, if you give them the skills to recognize this patient, for example, as a patient who's got severe head injury and what should be the treatment you can do even without resources, it's important. As much as resources we should bring. I mean, in fact, most of the programs fall there. What was really overt was that we were the only, it's called a Muzunga, which are white-faced people. Like you walk around, they go, oh, Muzunga, Muzunga. We were the only Muzungas in the village. There was not a single other person there, not one. We're the only white-faced people there. There were no placards on the wall of these are the people who've come to help us here, which means that every project that has ever been done there, I'm sure we're not the first people to walk through the door, every project that has ever been done there fails. And I think, and when we ask them, why have all the people before us failed? They say it's because you don't come and ask us what we need. You come and bring what you think we need. Come and ask us what we need. So I said, what do you need? And they said, we need you to come and listen to us and understand our needs and give us the skills, not the resources, give us the skills to deal with it within the resources that we've got. And one of the only projects that worked was another doctor called Deborah from Israel. And she was a gynecologist, and she went there and she was there for a couple of months to try and understand what they need. She realized that a lot of women die in childbirth, and they're women who had high-risk pregnancies. And the reason they die in childbirth, they never came beforehand to the hospital. Why didn't they come beforehand to the hospital? Because nobody's following them up, and it's a 3-day walk. Now, what is the cheapest resource they have? There is buildings. I mean, people come in Uganda and they camp out at the hospital. The hospital was full of clothes, like all of the hedges had clothes hanging on them. People are cooking outside the hospital. Makes no difference to them whether they live in their mud hut or they live in the hospital. So what she did was she organized for the WHO to build a building. A building is nothing. It's a tin hut. It's got no facilities. Like I said, it's barely got electricity. It's a tin hut with tin beds. And now what they do is that they encourage women to come 2 months before. Women, 2 months before, come and get checked. You've got a high blood pressure. They keep them in the hospital for 2 months because it's cheaper to keep them in the hospital for 2 months. You don't have to do anything for them. The family brings them food. There's no sheets. The family washes their sheets, brings them their clothing. And what you do is you catch them before they die in a high-risk pregnancy, and they save lives. So that's understanding their needs as opposed to coming with what you think is right. So that's what we're trying to do, understand what they need.
And that's such an important concept as well. I remember, I mean, this is obviously not on the same scale as what you do, but I remember when I was in uni, we had a trip to India to find out sustainability. And one of the first things that they mentioned to us is don't come as this, white savior thinking that you're going to save the world, because it's just not going to work. It's not going to happen. And it actually creates some sort of like an aversion towards, genuinely want to come and help. I guess, what is the attitudes now of Ugandans that now see that you're coming to listen and coming genuinely to help? Has the attitude changed now, or is it still, do they have some sort of like an aversion to you coming, and is it kind of, all right, next group's coming, it's not, nothing's going to change, it is what it is?
I think they're a little bit skeptical, but they're such a wonderful people. They are literally the most warmest, most inviting people ever. They're a pleasure to deal with, just a pleasure. I mean, that was one of the reasons why Uganda? Why not anywhere else? It's all the same, basically. But firstly, Shai Pintoff is there. But secondly, we fell in love with the people. We fell in love with the way they responded to us. You say hello, they say you're most welcome. Haven't done anything yet, but you're most welcome. And they're just wonderful people. They've got a wonderful attitude to life. And one of the things they said to us, we're looking forward to learning from you. And I said, no, we're going to be learning from you. We're here to serve you. We're not here to teach you. And that's the way it needs to be. And so I'm not concerned. I think it's going to be great.
That's really amazing. And do you have these projects specifically, have they been expanded to other nations around the world? Do other nations know, or other countries know about these projects? And is there any kind of opportunity for collaboration?
So basically, again, as we said, we jumped on the bandwagon of Shai Pintoff landing in Uganda. I think you have to be a bit modest. First of all, we haven't got a lot of people in Israel who are getting on board at the moment. In family medicine, they started the family medicine program a couple of years ago, and it's a bit of word of mouth. Like, people are skeptical about going, and now it's really taken off, and there's always a family medicine doctor there working in the clinics and stuff. So that's actually really happened. We're just setting it up. At the moment, I've only got, I think it's 9 doctors from around the country who are talking about going. I think we have to show success, and then people will come on board, and then we could talk about expanding. But I think we have to be modest. By the way, I sent letters to the Zionist Federation in January when I was in Uganda, saying, would you guys like to be involved? Because I don't think it has to be something exclusively Israeli. I'd love to have Australian doctors and nurses and physios and social workers, anybody. I'd love to have them involved. It would be a fabulous thing to be able to do together. I sent off a couple of letters. I don't recall if I got responses, but this is definitely something we could do as a joint project.
Well, that sounds like an incredible opportunity, something that we can definitely take on. But something you mentioned about Israel perhaps not being so on board, or Israeli delegations not exactly being on board. Do you perceive this as a long-term sustainable project that you guys are trying to kick off? Or do you think that if there's too much pushback that maybe it might fail?
As I said, I've got experience in doing national projects. You have to get them working. You have to show something, and then people get on board. There's very few people that come on at the start. We have to prove ourselves. We have to go there. I think if we've got 2-3 people going there and getting any results, everybody will want to get on board. So what we're doing is we took the core people. We really tried to sell it. We spent a year trying to sort of publish it. Who wants to come? We'll get a part of your rotation. Get a part of your rotation. Come on board. Got very little interest. We've got the few core people who are interested. We've got to make sure we get them there, and then I'm sure it'll spread like wildfire. I think it's sustainable because it's really not very expensive. It's really not very expensive. We've got places set up there. The other thing you do in Uganda and in third world countries, you have to get buy-in. They have to feel like they're giving something as well, so it's not a one-way relationship. So we've asked of them accommodation. Now, accommodation is a roof, if you're lucky, with running water. So it's not really a big deal, but they're providing us with the accommodation, so that's their commitment, and we're committing to coming. I'm not concerned about it taking off. I think I'm not surprised that it's staggered and it's going to take some time, but we'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually got a great question in the comments here, pertaining to your work in Uganda. Did you find any anti-Israel feelings, even though you were there as people that came to help, or nothing like that? No, the opposite. No, not at all. You know what? They don't really know about Israel. It's not really on the top of their. I mean, we're talking about, when I say primitive, I can't tell you how primitive their circumstances are. We weren't in. We specifically didn't go to the main cities. We weren't in Kampala. We were in a place called Hoima and Chiboga, which are just, I mean, they're tin. If they're living in tin shacks, they're lucky. So they're really not connected with the world. They really don't know. They don't care. As I said, we're not Israelis. We're Mzungas. They were more interested in the fact that we had white skin. And no, there was no anti-Israel. They were, that they will tell you, we know a song, Hava Nagila, that sort of level of awareness. So no, not at all. Not at all. So I guess the work that you're doing is actually bringing a really positive image for Israel, which is what we love to see, what we love to hear, which is it's really excellent. So for the last question, I guess, that I really wanted to ask is, given Assuta is relatively young, and you as well as the director of such an incredible hospital, which has made headlines as well. I mean, is there any final messages that you'd like to convey to the Jewish community about the work that you do, about things that final lessons that we can take off for the future, I guess, for our community?
Sure. I think that sometimes people look at Israel and think it's there, it's done. What have we got to contribute? And it's incredible how on one hand we are, at the head of, like I said, mass casualty events. We are right up there as a startup nation with so many innovations, and we really are. And on the other hand, there's a lot of places where you can actually contribute and you can actually make a difference. And I was fortunate that my passion was always emergency medicine, and I was fortunate in a way to find an area in Israel which was not developed. Emergency medicine needs to go a lot further here, and it's really somewhere where you can help. I call on Australians, come give your experience, come, give your expertise. Let's strengthen the relationships, because I think there's really a lot we can do. And as I mentioned before with Uganda, there's no reason why we should be doing these projects on our own. We'd be happy to be doing them together.
Excellent. Well, Bren, I'm going to hand back over to you now. Thank you so much, Deborah, for taking the time to speak to us. It was such an insightful discussion, really, really interesting and fascinating. And we look forward to, hopefully in the future, hearing more about some collaborations between Australia and Israel in the medical field. Bren, over to you.
That would be amazing.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mai,
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mai, and thank you, Deborah, for that. I'm so glad we were able to speak briefly about Marta Weiss at the beginning of the conversation. And I'm really sorry for your family's loss of what was a remarkable woman. And, my mum reached out to me during this conversation and said, Bran, what a great change it was to have this human element of Israel. We're usually talking about politics and diplomacy and the rest of me, and she was so thrilled that that tonight we could really speak about this really important aspect of Israeli society and Israel as a country and the human element. So thank you so much for doing that. But I do have to say, in 3 weeks' time, we're going straight back into diplomacy. On the 11th of June, our next ZFA conversation, we'll be speaking to Dennis Ross. And Dennis served as the US negotiator during the Oslo peace process under Bill Clinton, and he also served under the Obama and Bush administrations. He's now with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's the author of numerous books, and my doctoral dissertation referenced those works dozens, if not hundreds of times. So I'm really excited to speak to him in about 3 weeks' time. I'm sure you'll all be there to join me on the 11th of June. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and thank you again, Deborah and Mai.
Thank you.